Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, January 31st, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about Montana. Montana. Remember that state because it is going to be one of the most important in this election cycle as Democrats look to maintain control of the United States Senate. Now, I made a video about this, I believe yesterday, talking about the early ad reservations in the Montana and Nevada Senate races there, but in this video, we are going to be talking about the Republican response to the Democratic Party's major ad investments in this state, in which they committed over $50 million to this battleground state after Democrats came in with just a quarter of $100 million. And so with these sort of, two contending parties on this state, we are starting to see exactly where both parties will be prioritizing their money, their dough, whatever you want to call it, in this election cycle. Now, Montana is a state that has always been at the point of scrutiny for the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. I think they have looked at this state as a prime opportunity on both sides of the aisle to maintain a seat that they currently held, which right now Jon Tester, the Democratic senator from this state, is the incumbent, and Republicans see it as a prime opportunity as a state that they can pick up. To give you a bit of context as to why this is such an important state for both sides of the aisle, in 2018, Jon Tester won re-election to the United States Senate by a margin of around 3 points. It was a close and competitive race, and it came after Donald Trump's 2016 victory in the state by a margin of around 15 points. In 2020, Donald Trump also won the state by around 15 points against President Biden. It actually did see a reduction in margin, so it was a little bit above 15 in 2016, but regardless, this state had been declared a safe red one, including in this upcoming election cycle. And so this would be the first Senate election that Jon Tester would be running in alongside this same ballot as a presidential contender. The last one being 2012, when he won against his Republican opponent with a plurality victory that's important, I'll point it out in just a moment, by a margin of around 4 points. And the reason why I mentioned this plurality victory is because Dan Cox, the Libertarian nominee in this state, was largely blamed for the Republican Party's inability to defeat Jon Tester in this Senate race. Danny Redberg, who was the Republican nominee in this state, only got around 45% of the vote. Jon Tester got around 49% of the vote. Dan Cox, the Libertarian, got around 7%. And so when you see a major chunk of a right-leaning third party capturing a huge proportion of the vote share here, it calls into question, if the Libertarian wasn't there, would Jon Tester still have won? And of course, that all comes into speculation, but it certainly matters on a presidential election ballot because it meant that Jon Tester did not win the majority of voters. In fact, they voted against him in terms of the majority vote. Mitt Romney, on the other hand, defeated Barack Obama by a margin of around 14 points in this state. Now, Montana, interestingly enough, for a little bit of a history lesson here, in 2008 was one of the most competitive states in the election. North and South Dakota, now states that Republicans win by 30 to 40 points, also were amongst the more competitive states. Both of them decided by a margin of around 8 points, and Montana was decided by a margin of around 2 points. And so when Montana was very, very close in 2012, Democrats were thinking this could help Jon Tester, and in a way they were right. They were not too opposed to voting for a Republican when it came down to to a Democrat when it came down to national politics, but they still overwhelmingly voted for Mitt Romney, but not by the same margin that they voted for Donald Trump in the past two elections. And so it matters about that because it shows that the 2016 election, if Donald Trump is to replicate that in 2024, which current polls seem to suggest might be a possibility, he actually wins the state. It was actually well above 15. It was a 21-point margin. The Libertarians here getting around 6% of the vote, very similar to where it was in 2012. The only difference now with 2024 coming around the corner is that a lot of this depends on who the Republican nominee is going to be. It also depends on exactly what we will see in terms of third-party viability, because on the Libertarian side, only one person has declared, but the question is, will they actually make it through to the general election? Now, Jon Tester right now is the only Democrat who has declared his candidacy for the Senate race. He will not be facing any primary challenger there, and it doesn't look like anyone really wants to spend the time running against him. On the Republican side, though, it's a bit more competitive. Tim Sheehy, who is the founder and CEO of Bridger Aerospace, that shouldn't really matter to you, but the fact is, he is somebody who has been propped up by conservative media, by Fox News, by the NRSC, the National Republican Senatorial Committee, because they want him to be the nominee. Their reason In this announcement pending section, you have a very known name in the state of Montana, Representative Matt Rosendale, who used to represent the district at large and won his first race back in 2020 and won Montana's second district race in 2022 by an overwhelming margin, a very interesting margin, if you ask me, because it's a very interesting district there because it was drawn to be a Republican lockdown and he didn't exactly face a Democratic opponent. I'm not going to spend time talking about it. Definitely do your research if you're interested in what I'm talking about here. But regardless, Matt Rosendale first won his election back in 2020. But the reason why people are so worrisome about him being the Republican nominee is because 2020 wasn't his first race. His name might have rang a bell because in 2018, he was the Republican nominee for Senate in this state. He ran against Jon Tester and lost by a margin that was under 4 points. And so in this state, he already has a reputation as someone who lost his election, ran for House Rep, ran for the 2nd District House Rep, and now is coming back to the United States Senate to try to run against Jon Tester again. And that's a problem for Republicans because he is the one nominee that Republicans believe would be much more easier to beat than some of the others who have even declared, even easier than, Brad Johnson or Tim Sheehy, who arguably don't have as much name recognition because Matt Rosendale's name recognition is plagued by the fact that he lost in 2018 and that voters aren't exactly enthusiastic about him in the first place. When you take a look, too, at who has endorsed Tim Sheehy, you find that it is a number of United States senators, including the incumbent governor, Greg Gianforte, who is the governor right now of Montana. U.S. representatives have endorsed Tim Sheehy, including the U.S. representative from Montana's 1st District. Matt Rosendale, on the other hand, has pulled up very minimal endorsements from a few state legislators across the state, but a notable one from the Speaker of the Montana House of Representatives. Now, Matt Rosendale has yet to announce. There is a huge indication here that he will, in fact, announce because of a lot of swaying factors here that would encourage him to run in the Senate race. For one, he has been very vocal about Tim Sheehy being a D.C. plant, somebody who isn't actually representing Montana voters, and somebody who should not be the nominee. He's been very vocal about that in press, on social media, really any avenue. Another side of it, too, is the fact that Matt Rosendale has already seen a Republican challenger in his primary there when you see that I believe it is the president of the Montana Senate or the speaker of the Montana House, either or vying for a bid in Montana's 2nd Congressional District, which means some level of conversation has already been had in his district. And so now that he's considering running again in this Senate race, it only encourages him to do so more in Montana's 2nd District, across the state, because Montana's 2nd District at some point will be, captured by another Republican here. I'm trying to see if we can find the 2022 election cycle so we can fast forward to 2024. On the Republican side the list here, the president pro tempore of Montana's Senate, Montana's at-large Senate, or the Montana Senate, whatever you want to call it here, very much indicating here that they want to run for this district race. And you find that too, the Montana Superintendent of Public Instruction says that they won't run if Matt Rosendale decides not to. And I think that's really where you're starting to see why he might even run in the first place. There's a lot of encouragement from members on the internal side of Montana politics. He actually captures in a lot more of the Make America Great Again base, or the Trump base, whatever you want to call it, than you might think. He was endorsed by Trump in 2018. He's been endorsed by Trump in 2 subsequent elections. So Matt Rosendale very much has come into this with a big base to rely on. But his numbers aren't doing so well, which is why I think you are seeing some consideration here that Montana might not be as competitive if Tim Sheehy wins the nomination. But I think Republicans are very much scared. I think they respond to the Democratic Party's, spending in this race because they know there is a reality in which they lose it. And I think that it goes all the way back to 2016 again when we talk about the fact that we had an election where Donald Trump was able to win across the state by 21 points. Because that matters, because on the same exact ballot, the governor's race came into consideration. And Steve Bullock, the incumbent Democrat at the time, actually was able to win by 4 points on the same ballot that Donald Trump won by 21. It also is interesting, too, Montana has seen repeat candidates before run and win nominations. For instance, Greg Gianforte, who was the Republican nominee for governor back in 2016, ran again for that in 2020 as the, at the time, incumbent House rep. He decided to take a step back from the House election. He ran in 2017, won that election, ran in 2018, won that election, decided he wanted to be governor again, ran the same way Matt Rosendale, after he lost his election, became a representative and is now potentially running again. Greg Gianforte won that nomination and actually ended up winning. So it's also a thing there, too, that in 2020, Steve Bullock, the incumbent Democratic governor at the time, ran against Steve Daines, the Democrat versus Republican in this race. The Republicans ended up winning by around 10 points. Although Trump won the state by around 15, Steve Daines won by around 10. Only really a 5-point difference there, which isn't good news for Jon Tester in 2024. But it also isn't good news that you have been able to see somebody like Greg Gianforte go from losing in 2016 to winning the nomination and sure winning his election in 2020, but at that time, he wasn't running against an incumbent. I can guarantee you this election would have been a lot more competitive if Steve Bullock was the nominee again for governor. He just simply was term limited, and thus his lieutenant governor ran, but simply did not do too well. And so when you see the governor's race here with Greg Gianforte, who lost in 2016, making a return after running for Congress and winning a seat there and representing at large, it fuels the speculation and the worries of national Republicans that Matt Rosendale could do the exact same thing. The problem here is that Matt Rosendale did not announce early enough. When he was considering this a year ago, in fact, polls from less than a year ago show him at a very, very strong point. On Message Incorporated showed him with 36% of the statewide vote. In a Republican primary, Tim Sheehy at 2%. Public Policy Polling did a poll back in June, you're talking 7-8 months ago, with Matt Rosendale at 64%, Tim Sheehy at 10%. JL Partners did a poll in August showing Matt Rosendale at 52% to Tim Sheehy's 21%. And so this is the last time that Matt Rosendale led across the state. Then came in a huge ad blitz across a bunch of new mediums for Tim Sheehy. He also was propped up by many members of the mainstream Republican Party, including mainstream conservative media like One American News Network, like Fox News, like people on radio, on television, on social media. He was really brought up to a really strong point. And so then he got 44% in the poll to Matt Rosendale's 41%. Then it was 38 to 35, a little bit more competitive. And the most recent one from Coefficient shows 40 to 24. And a new one released today shows Tim Sheehy from, not released today, released in the past month from an internal from Tim Sheehy. I don't believe it's out here on Wikipedia just yet, but it's on the New York Times. Tim Sheehy has around a 30-point advantage over Matt Rosendale. And so Rosendale very much needs to announce if he wants to win this race. He's facing a similar problem and a similar dilemma that Ron DeSantis did, where he's so focused on the speculation around him running and he wants to build up more momentum before he actually does, that he actually ends up losing it. I can guarantee you if a year ago that Matt Rosendale said he was going to run for Senate, that he would have been universally, accepted by the GOP given some of these metrics very early on. But it reminds me a lot of when you see somebody like Ted Budd, who ended up in the United States Senate after 2022, after not doing so well in preliminary polling, but because nobody major had made a name for himself, and also Donald Trump might not be endorsing in this race, which actually would be good news for Tim Sheehy here. You see that in the Republican primary, the polls very early on did not suggest that Ted Budd was going to come anywhere close to the nomination. A lot of the polls that were done a year out from the election, in fact, in a very similar time frame like we are seeing now with June 2023, if we were to compare it to June 2021, you saw Ted Budd 19%, 21%, and some of the earlier polls 9%, 5%, and never really cracked that until well after the Trump endorsement and a huge bump from national Republicans. And thus, Pat McCrory, who was the former governor elected in 2012, lost his election in 2016, tried to make a run for it again with very early and very high name ID from the beginning, capturing a huge chunk of support in the early style of the campaign. You saw that dwindled and eventually amounted to practically nothing in the general election. By the time the GOP primary ended up happening here, Ted Budd ended up winning. And you saw that he got 58% of the vote, Pat McCrory at just 25%. So you see that, and this could be the real reason why Republicans end up winning the state of Montana now that they are investing $50 million in this state. But I equally take the $50 million as something that tells me that they are scared about this race. And when you look at states like Florida and when you look at states like West Virginia, Republicans know they are going to win those Senate races. They don't spend money there. They don't spend exorbitant amounts of money on races they simply know they are going to win, which tells me that something on the internal side too means that Democrats still have a very good chance in the state of Montana. even alongside the same ballot as President Donald Trump. Because believe it or not, Jon Tester is a staunch Democrat, has voted with Democrats down party line numerous times, but maintains himself as one of the most popular Democrats from Montana and one of the more popular Democratic senators. And so when you see that, and you see his general election coming up around the corner, there is a realistic possibility that he wins on the same ballot as Donald Trump winning by 15 to 20 across the state. It'll be very interesting to see if that actually ends up happening, what happens in this 2024 race. But right now, Democrats and Republicans are spending nearly $100 million combined in one individual Senate race, and the general election has not even begun. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.